right, good morning again. I want to bring everybody up to speed. If you weren't here last week, that's no problem. We're going to catch you up with the story. But we are in the 16th chapter of the book of Exodus, the second book of the Bible. And Exodus begins with the story of the birth of Moses. And Moses is the one who is going to take the people, the Hebrew people who are at this point in time slaves in Egypt under the bondage of Pharaoh. And he is going to be the one that God appoints to safely escort the people out of Egypt into the wilderness for 40 years, where they're going to have this time of transition before they eventually enter into the promised land. So last week we got sort of up to that point. We had the Israelites, they made it through the Red Sea. You remember the story, the parting of the Red Sea and so forth. They get into the wilderness. They're there for about 2.5 months. And then they start to really grumble because they would like more. And as is sort of human nature, they get to complaining quickly and they said, we're hungry out here, there's not enough, we're struggling. And so God tells Moses, he says, listen, tell the people that there will be quail that will fly and land on the ground every night at dinner time. That'll be your meat. And in the morning, I'm going to provide this flaky, mysterious substance which will be all over the surface of the ground, and people will be able to gather up 1 omer each, which I think you just saw had something to do with an ephah, which clears it up, right? So, but the point of it is that it's just enough for everybody to have their daily ration of bread. And so they pick that up, and they are able to take it back to their tents. And what I like is even in the beginning of this part of the story, there seems to be this idea that there is not just enough for everybody, that nobody's able to take more than that they need, except they can take just enough for the people in their tents. So let's just say, for example, somebody's ill, somebody's unable to physically gather manna off the ground. Even there, right there in Exodus 16, there is a provision so that you can gather enough to take back some for those who can't gather it for themselves. Otherwise, it says that if you take more than your fair share, 1 omer's worth, it's going to just disintegrate. And if you somehow gather up just a little bit too little, somehow that will be supplemented and there will be more than enough. And people tried to hoard it and take in more than their share, and the next day it was covered up in worms, which explains, if you didn't hear last week's reading, when Stephen read something about the worms, that was alluded to previously in the chapter. What I find so interesting about this story is really the Exodus story in the Old Testament, or in the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, is regarded to be the defining story of the Jewish people. It's the story that they base their identity on. It's where they get their covenant with God. It's where they get their understanding of God's people. It's where they are promised that there will be descendants will be numerous and that they will inhabit a land of their own. And it's where they learn, most importantly, to be dependent upon God. And that's why every year at the Passover, the story of the passing over, where the Israelites were able to leave safely from Egypt, that story is retold in its entirety every year at the Passover celebration in the spring. But what I find also very interesting about this is that this is the first time that God has appointed somebody like Moses to say, okay, this is where we're going to learn our identity. Here's our values. Here's the things that make us unique and sets us apart. I am your God. I am the one and only God. You are going to be a monotheistic people. And we're going to have a set of laws and rules and regulations. And the very first thing that God teaches them when they are in the wilderness in this 40-year transformational period is a twofold lesson. The first we talked about last week, which is, I'm going to provide this manna on the ground for you so that you know that you can depend on me and you will be dependent upon me. This is not about self-sufficiency. This is not about relying only on yourselves. You are going to do this as a community, and you are going to do this depending on me for what I provide to you. But it's also in the very first lesson that God teaches the Israelites, a lesson in stewardship. You heard Amanda do a beautiful job in the children's moment with the jars. Some of you have taught this method to your kids. I love the visual representation. That's why I just brought it up here and set it on the table. That idea of spending money, saving money, and giving away money as part of the ethics around money that we teach our kids. And when some of you were taught to give or received an allowance like this when you were children. Some of you as parents have done the same thing with your kids. And that idea of there's some of the money that you get, some of it should be designated for spending, some for saving, and some for giving. And this actually plays out in the text that Stephen read just a little bit ago. So let me walk you through that in case it wasn't clear. The first is when the manna appears in the ground. This is what they have to live on. This is the daily bread. This is the rationing of food that each one gets. And this is, in large part, the spending money part of the lesson. This is the food that they get every single day. They get to eat it. They get to consume it. That is for them and for them alone. It is the eating portion. Then the part that we introduced into the story today comes on the night before the Sabbath. So on Friday nights, there would be enough bread where everyone was able to gather not just one omer or one portion, but 2 portions. It's the saving portion. Tonight and tonight only, each week, you can have that extra portion, and that will be your Sabbath portion, so that you can truly rest on the Sabbath day. There will be no gathering, no harvesting, no scavenging or foraging. It is just going to be enough that you will be able to gather up on Friday, and you will have enough on Saturday. It's jar number 2. And then we have an interesting part that's almost, it's snuck in at the very end of the passage. It's almost like a footnote in the whole story, where Moses says to his brother Aaron, "Now Aaron, I want you to go out because God has commanded us that you should go out and you should gather an extra omer, 1 more portion, and it is to go in a jar." Now, it's a gold jar, but I didn't have one of those. So it goes in a jar, and it's sealed, and it is supposed to be kept in the tabernacle. So we haven't gotten to the full part in the story where the Israelites are given the law, aka the commandments, and the rest of the rules by which they govern their society. But when they do, there's going to be this whole big box, this giant box, and it's going to be very detailed artistically, and there's going to be all this presentation around this special box, and inside the box is kept the commandments, and outside there is a jar that holds the manna of 1 portion, 1 omer's worth, and that is meant to stay there at all times. See, this is the part where we get to Amanda's 3rd jar, the giving the 10% jar. In this very first lesson, the Israelites go into the wilderness, they receive this manna, and they are told, you got your daily portion, you're spending, your tomorrow's portion, you're saving for the Sabbath, and this final portion should be set aside as a gift for God. And there will be a visual reminder in the tabernacle for your whole time that it is supposed to stay there. And every time you ever see it pass by, and every time you carry that tabernacle from one settlement to the next, over the next 40 years, as you are wandering in the wilderness and prepared to enter into the promised land, you are going to carry God's portion of the manna. Not because God needs the manna, but because you are to be reminded that this was a gift from God. This was a gift that is entrusted into your care, and you are going to set aside 1 portion to be God's portion. So much is this important that when we get to the New Testament and we're reading Paul's letter to the Hebrews, in the 9th chapter, it starts out this way. Now, even the first covenant had regulations for worship and an earthly sanctuary. For a tent was constructed, the first one, in which there was a lampstand, the table, the bread of the presence. This is called the holy place. Behind the second curtain was a tent called the Holy of Holies. In it stood the golden altar of incense and the Ark of the Covenant, overlaid on all sides with gold, in which there was a golden urn holding the manna, and Aaron's rod that budded, and the tablets of the covenant. Even in Paul's time, there was the understanding that inside the holiest of holies, which by that point was something only the priest who, by drawing straws, was able to go in there to do the duties of changing out the incense and make sure everything was in order and to pray. But there was still that golden urn in there with the manna from this story in Exodus 16. And it reminds us of the importance of this early lesson. When it comes to the resources that we have, will we continue to do how we instruct our children? To keep a portion for spending, the money we live on, the money that pays the bills, the money that buys the groceries. Will there be enough for saving for tomorrow, saving for that emergency project, saving for retirement? But also, at the outset, there is this part of offering this 10%, this daily bread portion that is set aside for God. And God does this, not because God needs the manna. God gives the manna. But God says, this lesson is so important that I want people to understand it, and I want this to be a value that is instilled in you so that as you continue to find your identity, as you continue to form your community over the next 40 years, and as you enter into a land of your own, the promised land, and now you have a full functioning society with rules and regulations and worship practices and so forth, I want you to know from day one how resources should be managed. And before that, even in Genesis, there is this bizarre story about how Lot was kidnapped by a marauding band of armies, and Abram, his uncle, goes in and tries to save him, and he takes his men, and they save Lot, and they free him, and they are all so grateful that Abram, aka Abraham, dedicates a tenth of everything that he has, rejoicing in what God has done. Sometimes when we think about financial stewardship in the church, we get it a little bit backwards, or we get this twisted just a little bit, and we think about this thing as like some sort of a church tax that we reluctantly pay. But if we take the example of Abram, it's a gift of rejoicing. I am so grateful for what I have in this life: my health, my life, my strength, my blessings, my family, my loved one, my community, my job, a home, enough to eat, that I am going to give out of rejoicing. It's like the same idea. We stand up and we sing songs, not because God needs a pat on the back, but because we can't help but share in our rejoicing and in our worshipful practices. This is an extension of that. And historically, the church has said, and the Bible teaches, that that looks like a tenth. And that's called, as Amanda said with the children, a tithe. And so, as I always say, look, not everybody is in a place where they can give a tenth. Some of us are early on in our careers. Some of us are going through a period of financial hardship, and this is not to be a guilt-inducing thing. And I have had people who come to me and say, I would like to join the church, but I can't give 10% at this time. That is not how this is supposed to be heard or interpreted. We give what we prayerfully believe God is asking us to give, but we move towards the tithe. We move in that direction. I share this story every year, but when Eleanor and I started out and I had my first church appointment and I was earning my first real paycheck, which was not real money, it didn't seem like it, and we couldn't do it. We could not. We were living below the poverty line, and giving 10% beyond that was not feasible. But we gave 4%. And within a few years, we were at 6%. And within 5 years, we worked our way up to 10%. and we haven't looked back. So this is not about, this is the formula that you all must follow and God is judging you if you don't. That is not the point. Quite the opposite. This is a gift of joy. This is a gift of gratitude. This is about the third jar. And this is something that we say we need to have as a part of our life and a part of our practice so that, like the Israelites who saw that golden urn pass in front of them every time that the tabernacle moved and the Ark of the Covenant went with it, they were reminded that they were dependent on God. God has provided for them, and they wanted to share something to show appreciation for God in the form of this gift of giving. So the gifts that we give to the church, they support the ministries that we love. They go to help those who are in need. They keep things running. They keep things moving. They keep the staff employed. They keep the gears of ministry turning. And we give thanks for that, and I thank you for your generosity. And I say all this week because you should have a letter in your mailbox, if you didn't already receive it yesterday, that is a letter explaining this whole concept of manna as an illustration of financial stewardship and preparing us for a prayerful conversation at home with your loved ones and making your decision about what your gift will be for the church and for this manna ministry in 2025. And next week, as we come to worship and we gather here in the sanctuary, we will worship together. We'll have an opportunity to share and turn in those cards that we have filled out this week, and then we'll rejoice with our potluck after the service is over. It's going to be a great day. We're going to have a baptism. As I mentioned, we're going to have a guest. We're going to have these desserts, and it's going to be a wonderful time of worship. So I ask that in these days between today and next Sunday, that you will ponder this story from Exodus 16, that we'll be reminded again of God's message to the Israelites. This is how I am inviting you to live. I will provide, and I want you to have enough. I want you to have enough for today, enough for tomorrow, and I want you to have enough to set aside some to remember your blessings and God's goodness in your life. Will you pray with me?